I like it because I know one thing for certain is that if you do get married, you must commit yourself to that.
For over half a century, he wasn't just a pop star, he was a British institution. An ever-present fixture in the charts, on our televisions, and in the hearts of millions. With over 250 million records sold worldwide, he's one of the best-selling artists of all time. His career is a story of impossible longevity, a timeline of #1 hits that stretches across an incredible 8 separate decades. They called him the Peter Pan of pop, the clean-cut, unsinkable icon who seemed to defy time itself. Then, one summer afternoon, the music stopped. The image shattered. The unsinkable star was plunged into a living nightmare, broadcast live for the entire world to see. It began with a phone call and ended with a man who no longer recognized himself in the mirror, a man whose life was so consumed by trauma that he physically collapsed. How did this happen? How did Sir Cliff Richard, the national treasure, find himself at the center of a storm that would threaten not only his career but his very will to live? He didn't just fade away from the spotlight, he was pushed. And the story of why he stepped back, why he traded the roar of the crowd for a life of guarded privacy, is more shocking and more profound than you can imagine. This is the story of how Cliff Richard vanished from public life, and now, we know why.to really get the magnitude of Cliff Richard's fall from grace. You have to understand the incredible heights from which he fell. His story doesn't start in the spotlight, but in Lucknow, India, in 1940, where he was born Harry Roger Webb. His family lived a life of relative comfort until Indian independence prompted a move back to Britain in 1947, a move that swapped a life with servants for a council house in Cheshunt. It was a humble beginning for the boy who would become British pop royalty. Like so many teenagers of his generation, Harry was electrified by the sound of rock and roll exploding out of America. Inspired by Elvis Presley and the raw energy of the skiffle movement, he grabbed a guitar and started his own musical journey. In early 1958, Harry Webb became someone new, Cliff Richard. His backing band, first called the Drifters, would soon become the legendary Shadows. That August, he signed with EMI, and just weeks later, released a song that would change British music forever. Move It was a raw, swaggering piece of rock and roll. It was gritty, authentic, and completely British. Hitting #2 in the charts, it's still widely seen as Britain's first true rock and roll song, the moment the genre truly crossed the Atlantic. Almost overnight, Cliff Richard was a sensation. He was dubbed the British Elvis, a rebellious figure with a Presley-like sneer and a magnetic stage presence that sent teenage audiences into a frenzy. He was exactly what the youth of Britain had been waiting for, a rock and roll hero of their own. Throughout the late 50s and early 60s, Cliff and the Shadows absolutely dominated the British music scene. Hits like Living Doll and Travelin' Light flew to #1. His fame was so massive that it naturally spilled over onto the big screen. Technicolor movie musicals like The Young Ones and Summer Holiday became cultural touchstones, practically creating their own genre and making Cliff the #1 cinema box office attraction in the UK for 1962 and 1963. He had his own TV show and was a constant, smiling presence in the nation's living rooms. He was charming, handsome, and seemed completely unstoppable, but in 1964, right at the peak of his fame, Cliff made a decision that threatened to derail everything. He became a devout evangelical Christian. This was a massive shift. In an era where rock and roll was often seen as the devil's music, many in the church viewed his profession as sinful. He was even told that you couldn't be an actor and a Christian. At first, Cliff thought he had to quit music altogether, feeling he could no longer be the crude exhibitionist the press had once labeled him. He seriously considered becoming a teacher. However, Christian friends advised him not to abandon his career, so he forged a new path. He started balancing his faith and his work, recording contemporary Christian music alongside his pop hits and using his fame to talk openly about his beliefs. Instead of killing his career, his faith redefined it. The rebellious rocker image softened into a more middle-of-the-road, family-friendly persona. It was a transformation that could have lost him his audience, but instead, it cemented his place in the fabric of British life. He became a symbol of decency and endurance. As the decades rolled on, Cliff Richard achieved something few artists ever do: he stayed relevant. He weathered the storm of the Beatles' arrival, navigated the 70s with hits like Devil Woman and We Don't Talk Anymore, and even embraced the 80s sound with Wired for Sound. He became a Christmas institution, delivering beloved festive number ones like Mistletoe and Wine and Savior's Day. In 1995, he was knighted by the Queen, the very first pop star to receive the honor. He was more than a singer, he was a constant, a reassuring presence who had been there for generations. He was Sir Cliff, the Peter Pan of pop, a man who seemed to exist in a bubble of endless success and goodwill. That bubble was about to burst in the most brutal way imaginable. August 14, 2014. Sir Cliff Richard was thousands of miles away, enjoying the summer at his vineyard in Portugal, a place he called his mental therapy, a sanctuary from public life. Back in Britain, a very different scene was unfolding. That morning, South Yorkshire police, acting on a single historical allegation of sexual assault from the 1980s, got a warrant to search his apartment in Sunningdale, Berkshire. What happened next turned a standard police procedure into a national spectacle. A BBC journalist had gotten a tip-off about the investigation and pressed the police for details. In a move that would later be fiercely condemned, the South Yorkshire Police not only confirmed the investigation but gave the BBC advance notice of the raid itself. So, as police entered the private estate, a BBC helicopter hovered overhead, broadcasting live footage on the afternoon news. The world watched as investigators rummaged through his personal belongings, his private sanctuary violated for all to see. Cliff Richard, a man who'd spent a lifetime building a reputation for decency, was now the subject of a live police raid over a sexual abuse claim involving a minor. For Cliff, the news came from a phone call. The shock was immediate and catastrophic. He would later describe the moment as soul-destroying. For 2 long years, from that day in August 2014 until June 2016, his life was on hold. He was never arrested, never charged, yet he lived under a cloud of suspicion so dark it threatened to extinguish him. The toll on his health was immense. He talked about waking up almost every night at 3:15 a.m., his heart pounding so violently he thought he was having a heart attack. The stress brought on a severe case of shingles across his head and face. In a diary at the time, he wrote, "I wake up in the mornings now and I feel I am disappearing. I look in the mirror and this other old geezer looks back at me." He later recounted how, just 2 days after the news broke, his legs simply gave way and he collapsed on the floor of his home in Portugal, weeping that he wasn't just facing a legal process, but a trial in the court of public opinion. He felt the sting of the "no smoke without fire" assumption. His name, once a symbol of wholesome entertainment, was now forever linked online with a dastardly deed. He was trapped in a nightmare, an innocent man fighting an anonymous accuser while his own name was dragged through the mud. He described the feeling of knowing you're innocent while the world watches and wonders, saying a false accusation could completely destroy you. Throughout this 2-year ordeal, he leaned on his faith and close friends. He spoke about making a conscious choice to forgive his accuser, not for their sake, but for his own, to release the hatred that was eating him alive. It was a small step to reclaim a piece of his own soul in the chaos. Finally, in June 2016, the Crown Prosecution Service announced that after a thorough investigation, there was insufficient evidence to prosecute, and no further action would be taken. The legal threat was gone. He was officially exonerated. But for Cliff Richard, the ordeal was far from over. The relief was huge, but so was the damage. A line had been crossed, and there was no going back to the man he was before that sunny August afternoon. The fight for his name, and for justice, was only just beginning. For most people, being cleared of wrongdoing would be the end of the story. But for Cliff Richard, it was just the start of a new chapter. The 2-year investigation had left deep scars, and the very public way he was humiliated demanded a response. The damage to his reputation and his peace of mind was profound, and he was determined to hold those responsible to account. This wasn't about money, it was about principle. It was about making sure what happened to him couldn't happen to someone else. That he launched a lawsuit against both the South Yorkshire Police and the BBC for the massive invasion of his privacy. The police force quickly admitted they were in the wrong, settling with the singer for £400,000 and issuing a formal apology. The BBC, however, decided to fight. They defended their actions, claiming they had a duty to report on a matter of public interest. The High Court battle in 2018 became a landmark case for privacy rights in the UK. The trial exposed the cozy and controversial relationship between the police and the press that led to the broadcast. The judge had to weigh the BBC's right to freedom of expression against Sir Cliff's right to privacy. The verdict was a massive victory for Richard. The judge found the BBC had infringed on his privacy in a serious and sensationalist way. He ruled that while a police investigation might be of public interest, the identity of the person being investigated is not, at least not until they are charged. The court concluded that Sir Cliff had a reasonable expectation of privacy and the BBC's broadcast was a flagrant violation of it. The judge was clear: the BBC was more interested in a big scoop than in legitimate journalism. Sir Cliff was awarded an initial £210,000 in damages from the BBC. Combined with the police settlement, the initial awards totaled over £600,000, with more to be assessed later for the financial hit he took. But more important than the money was the vindication. The court had officially condemned the actions that caused him so much pain. When the verdict was read, friends said he didn't punch the air in celebration. His body language was just one of pure, unadulterated relief. In the aftermath, Cliff began to talk openly about the trauma. He said that although he was past the terrible time, he would probably never get over it. The experience fundamentally changed him. It shattered his trust in institutions he'd respected his whole life. It exposed the brutal, unforgiving side of a media landscape he'd been part of for nearly 60 years. The man who came out of this wasn't the same one who went in. He was more guarded, more wary, and had a painful new understanding of just how fragile a lifetime's reputation can be. This wasn't just a news story, it was a personal violation that reshaped his entire outlook. The desire for a quieter, more private life, which had been growing for years, now felt like an urgent need. The public spectacle of the raid and the torment that followed were the main reasons for his retreat from the constant public gaze. He had won in court, but he'd lost his sense of safety. The spotlight, once a warm and welcoming place, now felt dangerous. The ordeal Cliff Richard went through raises huge questions about media ethics and the rights of people before they're charged. If you've been following stories like this, hit that subscribe button and let us know your thoughts in the comments. Cliff Richard's disappearance from the spotlight wasn't like a light being switched off. It was more like a slow, deliberate dimming, a conscious decision born from a painful experience. The trauma of 2014 was the turning point, but the seeds of this retreat were planted long before. He didn't just vanish, he withdrew. He chose to protect his peace. One of his first moves was to sell the Berkshire apartment where the raid happened. The property was tainted by the memory of the violation, and he just couldn't feel at home there anymore. His life shifted more and more to his properties abroad, especially his villa in Barbados and his vineyard in Portugal. These places offered more than just sunshine, they offered anonymity and a shield from the British media. In Barbados, where he is now a citizen, he could enjoy a quieter life, far from the world that had wounded him so deeply. He also started talking very openly about retirement, and his view is pretty different from many of his peers. He's been blunt about artists who announce big farewell tours, only to come back again and again. In one interview, he said, "Every time I hear of a comeback, I think, they've run out of money." He's made it clear he doesn't want anyone to think his decisions are about money, saying, "I would rather stop." His plan isn't to make a big announcement. Instead, he likes the idea of just stepping back quietly. He's talked about maybe taking a 2-year break without telling anyone, and then, if he feels like it, booking a few shows at the Royal Albert Hall. It's all about control. After having control so brutally taken from him, he's now the one calling the shots. He decides when, where, and how much he works. Then there's the simple reality of aging. Now in his mid-80s, Sir Cliff is remarkably fit, but he's also a realist. He's talked about not wanting to be a burden and has made arrangements for his future care. This foresight is part of why he's pacing himself, avoiding the grinding tour schedules that defined his younger years. The new reality for Cliff Richard is a life of balance, lived on his own terms. He has traded the constant adoration of the masses for the peace and privacy he now values above everything else. He's no longer the ever-present pop star, but a man who has reclaimed his life, choosing tranquility over the tyranny of fame. To say Cliff Richard has completely vanished would be wrong. He's retreated, not retired. He's built a new life of peace and privacy, but the passion that's driven him since he was a teenager is still there. He's stepped away from the all-consuming demands of superstardom, but he hasn't stepped away from music. The key difference now is that he makes music purely for the love of it. This freedom has led to a steady stream of new projects. In 2018, right after his court victory, he released the aptly titled album Rise Up, his first album of new material in 14 years. In 2022, he released Christmas with Cliff, and in 2023, for his 65th anniversary in the business, he released Cliff with Strings, My Kinda Life, an album of his classic hits reimagined with an orchestra. These projects show an artist who's still engaged and still loves being in the studio, and while the huge world tours are a thing of the past, he hasn't abandoned the stage. In late 2023, he undertook the Blue Sapphire Tour, which was met with huge enthusiasm from his dedicated fans. Crucially, he's already announced his next venture, a 2025 UK tour called Can't Stop Me Now. It's a limited run of dates, and the announcement made it clear that no more would be added, reinforcing the idea that these are special events. This isn't a comeback, it's a choice. It's him maintaining that connection with his fans, but in a way that he controls, within the boundaries of the peaceful life he's built. This new phase of his career has also subtly reshaped his legacy. The ordeal he went through, and his resilient response, added a new layer to his public persona. He was no longer just the Peter Pan of pop, he was a survivor. The public, who had watched his trial by media with shock and sympathy, saw him fight back and win. For many, his status as a national treasure wasn't diminished. It was solidified that he's still a beloved figure, but one who now operates from a position of strength and self-preservation. The music hasn't stopped. But the man who sings is different, wiser, more guarded, and completely in command of his own story. He still performs, but now, the audience comes to him, on his terms. The story of Cliff Richard's retreat from the spotlight isn't a simple tale of a star fading away. It's a dramatic, painful story of a man who was pushed to the brink, and in surviving, found a new way to live. For 60 years, he was a constant in British culture who gave his life to the public. In return, a part of that public world, a reckless police force and a sensationalist media, nearly destroyed him. The events of 2014 were the earthquake that shattered his world. The live broadcast of the raid was a violation that inflicted deep, lasting trauma. The 2-year wait for exoneration was a period of agony that changed his relationship with fame forever. His victory in court against the BBC was a landmark moment, a powerful vindication. But it couldn't erase the scars or restore the sense of trust that had been stolen. The man who emerged understood the terrifying price of a life lived entirely in the public eye, and so, he made a choice. He didn't retire in a blaze of glory. He quietly and deliberately began to withdraw. He traded the demands of superstardom for the tranquility of his homes in Portugal and Barbados. He exchanged the roar of the crowd for the quiet satisfaction of making music on his own terms. He is still Sir Cliff, the music icon. He still records albums and plans tours. But he is also Harry Webb, a man in his 80s who has earned the right to peace that he didn't vanish. He was pushed to the edge, and in pulling himself back, he chose to rebuild his life on a different foundation, one where privacy is paramount and peace is the ultimate prize. Cliff Richard stepped out of the constant, glaring spotlight, not because his star had dimmed, but because he'd finally found something he valued more. What do you think of Cliff Richard's incredible story of resilience? Check out this next video on another icon who faced the dark side of fame. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the lives of music legends.